About his budget proposals that are he's put in front of the legislature, and the legislature is dealing with it primarily in the taxation committees and appropriation committees. And part of my job and Teresa's job is to report back to our colleagues who serve on the Tax and Appropriations Committee with information from our communities. And so what I thought I would do is go through the sort of basic bullet points, the highlights of the budget proposal, which are on the sheet that is after the title sheet, if you turn it over. Highlights of the 2016-2017 budget. This was prepared by staff in the Senate Democratic office. So I thought I would go through that, and then there's a couple of backup documents that talk about revenue sharing and a few other pie charts that sort of tell the big picture of forecasted revenues and things like that over time. And then I just want to hear from you. So any questions before I get started? All right, great. Oh, one last thing. There's a clipboard. If any of you in the room are not getting my e-newsletters and you'd like to get them, please sign up. So the governor has proposed a $6.5 billion biennial budget for the state of Maine starting this July, and those are the fiscal years 16 and 17. And the state constitution requires a balanced budget, which is true in many states. We don't have the luxury of deficit spending like the federal government does. As I said, the legislature's appropriation committee and other policy committees will be working on the budget, and at the end of this part of the session, there will be some sort of deal brokered between the two bodies of the Senate and the House and the two parties, and it will have to get 2/3 approval of the legislature to pass. You've probably heard a lot about the governor's proposed changes to the income tax. He talks a lot about eliminating it, but he actually has not proposed that in these 2 years or even the 2 years afterward, but he is trying to lower especially the highest rate. Individual income tax rate would be reduced from 7.95 to 5.75 by 2019. And he changes a little bit the amount of income that would be exempt from being taxed at all. For a single filer would be up to $20,000, for a married couple up to $40,000, and a family of 4 up to $48,000. So that means the income up to those numbers would not be subject to income tax at all. He also proposes to eliminate all tax credits that are currently on the books and all deductions. So if you're taking a mortgage interest deduction, that would be eliminated. Charitable deduction, earned income tax credit, and the highest marginal corporate income tax rate would be reduced from 8.93 to 6.75. So in the income tax changes, you'll see that it would result in a loss of $723 million over the biennium, over the first 2 years of his next 4-year term. He proposes to make up a good chunk of that with increasing the sales tax, not only increasing it in rate on things that are already taxed, but in increasing the types of things that are taxed through the sales tax mechanism. But before I talk about the specific of the sales tax, I just want to draw your attention to the line at the bottom of sales tax changes, where it says the total sales and service tax changes will result in a gain of $617 million to the state over those 2 years. So if you see from the income tax reductions what we lose and then what we gain by changes in the sales tax, there's approximately $100 million in gap. So that is a huge change in the sort of basic revenue stream that would be coming in to the state. That's in the first 2 years. In the second 2 years, that gap would grow to $300 million. So that's a big hole to fill, either by cuts or some other revenue proposals. So the sales tax increases from 5 to 6.5 in 2016. And the service provider tax would increase from 5 to 6 in 2016. The meals and lodging tax would be decoupled, meaning they would not be paired. The lodging tax would not go back to 7%. It would remain at the current 8%. Meals and liquor tax would decrease in 2016. And the tax on short-term auto rentals would decrease 10 to 8% in 2016. So again, the sales tax base is broadened so that a variety of new items such as candy and snacks, amusements, and recreation are now taxed. One of the big things I've heard already from my constituents in my Senate district, which is Falmouth, Cumberland, Yarmouth, Gray, part of Westbrook, and Chebeaga, Long Island, is that he is proposing to tax professional services, and Maine would be the first state to do that. So that would be a tax on services provided by attorneys, accountants, engineers, and a whole new set of professionals that have never had their services taxed before. And there are a lot of those types of professionals in this district. So they are not happy about that. And I could talk a little bit more about that if you want me to. Are there any questions before I move on?
Does the increased tax on professionals include medical?
Excuse me,
Does
Dawn?
the increased tax on professionals include people such as doctors, nurses?
No.
I mean, teachers, I mean, there
No.
are people who are,
No.
so
It's,
it's a very narrow professional.
yeah. So I'm gonna move on to the proposed changes in property taxes. Hi, Mary. Mary Nelson just came in, former state rep, and Beth Franklin, former Falmouth School Board member. Nice to see you. Revenue sharing. This would directly hit our property taxes right off the bat. Revenue sharing, just to remind people how that's generated, is 5% of your town's income tax and sales tax gets sent to Augusta and put into a big pot, and then it gets redistributed based on a formula including population density and property values, and gets redistributed to the towns. It covers a lot of what the towns provide in their retail section, their retail area of providing services that the state requires them to do, and it covers that as well as some other things. The homestead exemption right now is $10,000 for every homeowner, meaning that the first $10,000 of value in your house is not subject to property tax. Governor LePage proposes to change that so that for folks over 65, the property tax, the homestead exemption rather, goes up to $20,000. And for people under 65, it is eliminated entirely. The property tax fairness credit is expanded, and that is a mechanism to help low-income folks recoup some of their property taxes through a rebate application. And that would be it wouldn't be expanded to more people, but the amount that people could get back would be a little bit more. He proposes to eliminate estate tax on inheritances in 2017. And then a big one I suspect people have been aware of is that he proposes a mandatory tax placed on local nonprofits by municipalities on properties, nonprofit properties assessed at an average value of over $500,000.
Kathy, isn't that,
Yeah.
you said that's mandatory, the town has no choice?
Correct.
They go to that town
The-
Hasn't the legislature refused to?
So, yeah,
So
I'll be
far.
updating you on that. And the thing about that is, it's interesting because that is a tax that, if it were to go into place, there's a very big geographic difference there. For instance, the town of Falmouth has a big main med building, and it's got other properties here that are owned by nonprofits, and churches, houses of worship are exempt from this, but the town of Gray, which is one of the towns I represent, has no nonprofit property that meets the $500,000 threshold. So they would get no dollars whatsoever from that. And as you can imagine, it's, in my opinion, this is very slanted towards more populated areas that would have more nonprofit properties in them. Any questions before I move on? All right. The impact on the safety net. Right now, all municipalities are reimbursed 90% for their general assistance costs until the threshold of 40% of total costs over a 6-year average is reached. Reimbursement then drops to 10%. So this is a cut in general assistance to towns across the board. He also is proposing to cut the Medicaid savings plan that is designed specifically for people over 65 to get discounts and rebates on their medications. He proposed to cut $10 million for the Fund for Healthy Maine. That's the fund that came out of the tobacco settlement that is used primarily for tobacco use prevention and a lot of different public health prevention kind of efforts. And he also is trying to make cuts to rural critical access hospitals and outpatient mental health services. Those are basically rate cuts so that the folks who provide those services could no longer afford to provide them because they would get reimbursed at such a low rate, they would lose money providing that service. Yes, Bob?
Does it kind of look like we're gonna become an unhealthy state? with less health, but-
That's a real possibility, in my opinion, yeah. So then lastly, the education piece is down, he's cutting, well, I should really let Teresa give you an update on education because she serves on that committee. But there are some gains. For instance, there's $10 million appropriated to the Maine State Grant Program. Right now, people who apply for Maine State grants get $1,000. That was put into place in the 1990s. It hasn't gone up with inflation. So one of the proposals that came out of a big college affordability program study was to up that to $2,500 per pupil. But it looks like this would be about a $500 increase. So those kids who apply now who get only $1,000 would get $1,500, which is better, but not a huge gain. The Maine Community College system is flat funded, and we're giving 0.5% more to the university system under that proposal. The next page tells a little bit of a story about revenue sharing. This is all the towns in our Senate district, and it shows the difference in what we get in revenue sharing in the town of Falmouth and what we would lose. It also has a note about how Falmouth would come out with the nonprofit tax. And then this is a really simple, yes,
Kathy, can you tell us what we were getting there this year?
in Falmouth.
Yeah,
Um,
do you recall?
I think it's in this first
Maybe
column.
not.
Yeah, it's in the columns.
446,293.
Okay, that's what we're getting for this year.
This
that
year.
we're in.
Yeah.
No, this year that we're in is fiscal year 50.
In the next fiscal year, it's not projected to change very much. The year that it's eliminated is in the second year of the biennium.
Right.
Oh, I see, okay. So the governor's proposal only affects the second year of the biennium?
Yes,
Thank you.
for revenue sharing.
Thank you.
This is just a map that, not a map, a graph rather, that the Maine Revenue Service put together that shows what's happened to revenue sharing over the last decade. It's been steady decline under the LePage administration, and that's been a typical goal of his, has been coming since he was elected, to reduce or eliminate revenue sharing. And then these other graphs, you can take a look at your leisure, but I thought for now, if folks want to hear from Teresa about some education updates, we could do that, and then just discuss what you've heard. You wanna
Sure.
take it
Could I ask a question before we move on?
Sure.
Is there a Democratic proposed budget at this stage?
We are definitely working on taking what we've heard from our constituents and turning it into a proposal.
But nothing yet?
Nothing yet.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So Kathy's done a great job of highlighting sort of the big components. The largest thing that really, a number of years ago, the state said they would commit to a 55% of share of the education. Never got anywhere near that. This year, it's gone down a little bit in terms of meeting that. The humane system has been neglected and not been flat-funded for a few years, and now that's got a little bit of a bump, which you alluded to. And the main college system is flat-funded. I will give you an update from the committee, though. We proposed in our budget to the appropriations committee that we would not, we wanted to hit the 55% as far as we could go, but it's always difficult to do that. But what we wanted to do is not impact the mill rate at the local town level. And that's increasing up to 8.4% for the school that then they absorb and throw back into the mix with the town. So our committee is unanimous in wanting to give more money to education. We differentiate on the amount, $25 million to $49 million. That $49 million would keep that mill rate flat for this year and get us another step or two closer to the 55%, but of course not all the way. So that's a proposal that we have into approps. We also recommended that the Maine Community College get $6 million and not be flat funded, so that's in the Appropriations Committee as well for discussion. And the additional $10 million for the Maine State Grant Fund, we recommended that increase to $2,500. There was extensive analysis done that the differential for kids to be able to go to college, not go for a free ride, to have skin in the game, their parents are paying something, they've got a job, they're taking out debt, but to increase the grants would really be an improvement because you're not paying back a grant, you're able to go, and the $2,500 kind of gets them to that level. So we've recommended that as well. So we'll see what happens in appropriations. We presented our budget to them, and now they'll throw the mix in with all the other things that we've heard from our community. So
What was the vote on your proposals?
let's see, oh, I have that right here so I don't mess it up. The 25 was the flat funding for the mill was a divided report. That was 25 million and the 49 million. 49 million were all the Democrats and one Republican, and the rest were the Republicans. The Maine Community College was unanimous, and for that to go in. And then we also encouraged the appropriations, which isn't on this list. There's a $10 million, $5 million in each biennial for communities to look to ways to consolidate within school systems, and that was a 11-1 vote. So those are the major ones.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, questions, comments? Hi, Karen. Yeah, Jerry.
Is there any movement of the nonprofits? Is there any movement by the legislature to drop some of these nonprofits and let them have this tax?
Yeah, a couple of the proposals have come in front of the tax committee already, and I'm pretty sure that the nonprofit tax was was unanimously rejected. Yeah, so that's not gonna have any legs.
What about the funding from, you mentioned mental health? I know that Sweets has already said that they will probably have to close their doors. They're the largest mental health service in southern Maine, at least, if the cuts go through. Has anybody come up, has any discussion?
There was an enormous amount of testimony in front of appropriations and DHHS on those cuts, but I don't know. Ultimately, it will be up to the appropriations to figure that out, and they
And
haven't.
they haven't said anything
No.
about that yet. Has anybody made any comparisons or brought up any information about the failure of the Kansas, which is very similar to what LePage is proposing? He did not eliminate state taxes, but he reduced it greatly, and they have a huge budget deficit. They're making cuts to all kinds of road repairs, bridge repairs, education, everything in the state is being cut, and there's a huge budget shortfall still, because their revenues with the sales tax increase did not help fill that gap. Has anybody been looking at other experiments that these governors are doing that have failed?
Yes. We get a wealth of information, not only from our constituents, but from national organizations, including advocacy organizations. So we have heard a lot about or I should say, I've heard a lot about the analogy with Kansas. And I think it's a valid, very, very valid concern. Teresa?
A couple other just notes
Yeah.
of the taxation committee. So they voted unanimously not to tax nonprofits. They also voted unanimously to keep the homestead reduction. So that's interesting. And they voted unanimously not to collect tax on telecoms and property. And they rejected the expansion of the sales tax to professional services unanimously. So the taxation has done hard work all of our committees are joint standing, and they represent both Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. So to come out unanimous.
And the House and Senate.
Senate, right. So to get all those cats, herding those cats along is an impressive feat to have unanimous votes on that, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's taken Republicans, I think they've shown a lot of courage to vote unanimously with the Democrats to defeat a number of these key parts of the governor's proposal. Pam?
When Governor LePage was in Cumberland, I'd like you to not do that. Is that possible? To
This is
film
a
me?
public meeting. I'm allowed
public
to,
people vote.
I'm allowed to record a public meeting.
You are allowed, but she just asked you as
I'm asking you
I'm
politely not to.
rejecting that, okay?
No, it's not okay.
Well, it's okay for me then.
It's obnoxious. It's totally obnoxious.
Ask your question.
The Governor LePage, when he was in Cumberland, spoke about the revenue sharing being decreased, but that the income tax savings were orders of magnitude greater.
right.
And I'm assuming he would think the same thing about Falmouth,
Mm-hmm.
where I think in Cumberland, I don't remember the numbers for Falmouth, but in Cumberland it was, what was $400,000 in revenue sharing, there was gonna be millions and millions saved in income tax. Has anyone directly confronted the fallacy of that logic, that people who are getting income tax cuts are not gonna walk down to town hall and write Nathan a check so that he can fill the potholes?
Right. Well, there was a great question at that meeting that evening as I left. There's a gentleman who's been on the Cumberland Town Council for many years named Bill Stiles, who I've known since I was on the Falmouth Council. And he is generally a very conservative guy. And he said to me as I was on my way out, and he said, "Here's what I don't understand. People are going to have more money in their pockets, but how do I get that into my budget?"
Right.
And I said, "You don't, Bill." That's the point.
But has the legislature, I mean, has that been openly expressed
Yes.
as the difficulty or the fallacy of that?
Yes.
The second thing,
And that's where I tried to point out, there's a $100 million gap in the first 2 years, and that goes up to $300 million in the second 2 years.
the other thing, my other question is that I'd like to ask, the sales tax is highly regressive.
Mm-hmm.
What is the explanation where Governor LePage campaigned on the idea of helping working Maine families? How does a highly regressive sales tax help working Maine families? I understand there's a tax credit for poor folks. I'm talking about working folks.
I don't think it does. I mean, I think that sales tax is widely accepted as a regressive tax, meaning that it is harder on people of fewer means than of greater means. And one of the rationales for spreading the sales tax is to get more money from people who are visiting Maine from out of state. But in the governor's budget, he actually reduces those categories of sales tax somewhat in the first biennium and even more in the second biennium. So the notion of spreading the sales tax to recoup more out-of-state tax dollars is a great idea. This proposal doesn't do it.
Thank you.
Yep. Beth?
Is there any discussion at all in Augusta of consolidation of services that, between municipalities and what it's like costs?
Yes. And that's a struggle, that's an issue in every town. And I think Falmouth and other towns in our Senate district have actually done a remarkably good job at consolidating and working together to do things as efficiently as possible. The problem is you run into a lot of pushback from residents who really want a lot of local control. So consolidation often triggers the fear of loss of control, and that's a firmly held value in Maine as local control. So efforts to consolidate services sometimes run into that cultural phenomenon. So and the other thing is, Beth, is that it's interesting. There are some legislators like me and Teresa who have been on local boards, either school or town, but a lot of legislators have not, and they're not as they don't quite understand the effect across the system, So they're not as aware of what opportunities are out there for consolidation, in my opinion. Would you agree with that?
I would completely agree with that. I would say that, Governor Page, to his credit, did put something in for the education to give a kind of a carrot to encourage people to consolidate that $10 million fund, $5 each of the year. And if you can show savings over time, this fund would help you with upfront costs of doing something, whether it was if you were consolidating payroll and you need to buy computers and software, they would front that money to it. So I think, I give the credit where credit's due for that, if it's workable and doable. The devil's in the details about how you apply for that and get that, but it is there. I think people are thinking about it because it's not sustainable to keep going just the way we are without some change, so.